Without further ado, I call on Lucas to begin the debate.
What I remember very fondly from my days in St. Andrews was the drive, the ambition, and the sheer passion that people in this university really embodied all the time. Those were wonderful forces, this dedication. Those forces gave us the debating chamber, inspired many students to form their own enterprises and businesses, a feeling of entrepreneurship, innovation around town. Given those forces, given those passions of students, it's no wonder that we enjoy such a vibrant student life and societies, and will continue to do so in the near future, and far future, of course. Yet, ambition and excellence also set a very, very high bar. And because of this, I think that the fashion shows here must be set against the very, very high bar of the sheer passion and ambition that St. Andrews really embodies. When you work with incredible people in an incredible environment, you expect absolute perfection. This is especially true of Don't Walk and other fashion shows, which I've had the pleasure to work with some people in those fashion shows, and trust me, they are some of the most driven, passionate, and just incredibly motivated people I have had the pleasure to work with and meet. Of course, they are not as cool as the UDS, but they come close. Here. Yes. And yet, even though I've started out by praising the fashion show crowd, I'm afraid that I'm going to say that I rather oppose the fashion shows in St. Andrews. Not because they reveal, by a way of contrast, just how unfashionable I really am, but rather because they have not really reached the dreams that they aspire to, not really reached the level of passion that can usually be reserved for society in St. Andrews. As you can see, I ripped out a page of today's Saint. That's how far my research goes for such debates. And this piece of the Saint is quite incredible because it shows a review of the fashion show. And it's really taught me to look at fashion shows in a really interesting way. It's the first piece about fashion I've read which mentions the word metaphysics. It's the first piece of a fashion show that really made me see fashion as something ridiculously artistic, something that's really an outlet for free expression, and honestly, if the fashion shows in St. Andrews adopted the model that the Saint is proposing, we would all be very happy, and if I went asked to stand on a proposition, I would be sitting on the opposition. And yet there's one big passage that really comes out here. I'm going to read this all out to you now. Also, I'm told that there will be a lot of champagne on the tables. So even if metaphysics isn't your thing, who doesn't enjoy sipping on bubbles while gazing lustfully at hot models and beautiful clothes? I'm afraid that you are providing a very, very good case study for my speech, so thank you very much. But what I'm trying to say is that this is very much expressing the unfortunate reality of those fashion shows. They are not about navel-gazing metaphysics. They are not about trying to figure out the best and push art to its limit. Rather, unfortunately, they've turned into a champagne-driven party. And this is very, very interesting. Even if fashion shows are usually about complicated concepts that a humble Philistine, unfashionable as I might be, cannot understand, they are about those incredible concepts. They are about trying to discover something absolutely awesome, and they're trying to push that passion and drive and perfection to a high limit. Similarly, money is raised for absolutely fantastic causes for the fashion shows as well. But there's a fundamental disconnect, whereby most people going to the fashion show will hardly realize what those charities do. Essentially, it becomes one of the most disconnected forms of fundraising, in which you do fundraising for the sake of it, rather than because you care, in which fundraising is like buying fair trade, completely disconnects you from the process. You just want to buy your conscience, and you want to excuse yourself while having a great party. Because unfortunately, this is what fashion shows have become nowadays. And before anybody says that I'm a dull person, and people who know me will confirm that I am, I do enjoy great parties. I have nothing against fashion shows being a great party. Some of the best times that I've had in St. Andrews have been at absolutely great parties. In fact, I even came back as an alumni the first time, and I went to the 600th ball, which was an absolutely great party. So I have absolutely nothing against great parties full stop. Yet I'm sure that if those visionaries, the people with passion and drive, who initially had the idea of doing the fashion show, saw it degenerate into just a great party, not the use of the word just, they would not be particularly happy. They would not be particularly happy that their charity and fashion were so sidelined. Because what's happening here is that passions are being misapplied. Artistic endeavors are failing. We learn very little about the fashion when attending the fashion show, and very little about free expression. Ironically, don't walk has become fashionable, and that's become the worst thing for it. It's become fashionable, as have other fashion shows, so you go there in order to follow a certain trend, rather than because you really want to explore the metaphysics, you really want to explore the cool concepts that go beyond them. And this fashionable nature of it actually hides the awesomeness of the fashion shows, the complexity and the art from us, from the viewers. We essentially have turned it into such a fashionable ritual that we have completely lost touch with what the fashion shows are meant to be doing in the first place. So essentially, Don't Walk and other fashion shows, they are meant to be about self-expression. They are meant to be about openness. They are meant to be about breaking new boundaries. And taking a critical look at the world, you are meant to be leaving it and thinking completely differently. You're meant to be leaving it and using the word metaphysical to describe fashion. That's how mind-boggling they are supposed to be. And yet, unfortunately, none of this is happening because the fashion shows have become so ridiculously conformist. As I said, parties are absolutely incredible. And it's entirely to the credit of all the fashion shows that they've created an absolutely awesome party. But there are many opportunities for party here in St. Andrews. There are far fewer opportunities to really enjoy art, to really enjoy sophistication, and to really drive the passions that I love so much about that place. There are really few opportunities to enjoy fashion for the sake of art, for the sake of metaphysics, for the sake of understanding a charity. And because the fashion show fails on both the fashion count and on the charity count, instead becoming essentially a maelstrom of conformity, because I'm pretty sure that the initial founders and the visionaries and the people who put in so much work into the fashion show, those who work late, those who select everything, those who work so hard for the sponsorship, would and often are terrified to see it degenerate in just a party and nothing else for those people. Because the fashion show is not ambitious enough, because it has not reached all of its goals, those are the reasons, Madam Speaker, while I urge this House not to walk. Thank you. I'm sorry, back when I was here a couple of years ago, this was in a slightly different place, I promise.
I thank Lucas for his fine speech and for destroying our awards, and call upon Joe to continue the debate.
It's not broken.
Okay.
I would like to thank the first speaker for his fine speech, but I most respectfully disagree with some of his points. In this debate, it is not my place to argue that this House would walk, but simply to argue that the assertion that we wouldn't is wrong. We cannot tell people what to do. It is a free choice that everyone should be able to make for themselves. Even if I personally would choose not to walk, I would never argue that other people shouldn't. In this speech, I will tackle two main issues. Firstly, I acknowledge that there are, or there have become, many negative aspects to fashion shows. They can be a champagne-driven party, and perhaps some of the original intention behind them has been lost. These issues certainly need to be addressed, but they are not good reasons for saying that people shouldn't be able to walk. Secondly, I will address the many positive aspects that there are to fashion shows as reasons why people should. This debate is not about whether fashion shows are perfect, but about whether fashion shows in St. Andrews can be positive experiences, and about whether people have a right to take part. They do. If you want to walk, then walk. Neither I nor anyone else has a right to tell you not to. Will you be objectified in the process? Possibly. Is that your fault? No. Models may end up being groped on stage, but why does that mean that they should not be able to be models? We would never blame a survivor of rape or sexual harassment for what they were wearing or how they acted. Why does it suddenly become different when on the runway? It is unjust that we would suggest that people shouldn't walk because of the actions of others. The negative aspects of fashion shows, such as objectification and exploitation of people, are not the fault of the models. Other people objectify and exploit. These negative actions are acted onto them. They are not seeking to be objectified. There are numerous reasons why people may take part in fashion shows. It is fun, they care about art, fashion, it is a huge part of St Andrew's culture. The point is that I have yet to meet a model who has told me that they wish to take part in a fashion show because they wish to be objectified, or groped, or sexualised. If a model's reasons are positive, then they should walk. Why should we conform to the lewd actions of what is, hopefully, a minority? The culture around fashion shows may not always be positive, and the actions of those who attend may be reprehensible. Blame this on what you like: alcohol, the patriarchy, misogyny, a sense of entitlement. But we should not conform to this. Judge these actions, but don't tell people that they should therefore not walk. If people don't walk, they won't face these challenges, but that's not an effective solution. We cannot walk away from these problems, but face them. Men and women should be free and safe to celebrate art, body positivity, and fashion. If a model is groped, the solution is not to tell them not to walk, but to put measures in place to ensure that they cannot be groped. If people are sexualised, the solution is to change people's attitude. This takes time. This is difficult, but this is a better long-term solution than telling people not to walk. I believe it is wrong for this house to set a blanket rule that people shouldn't. Fashion shows may need to change, but people should be free to model. This is my first reason for opposing the motion, that fashion shows do have issues and problems, but the solution is not to censor people's right to take part in them. Fashion shows should be altered, not banned. My second point is that we must be careful not to exaggerate the negative aspects of fashion shows at the expense of forgetting what is positive about them. Fashion shows are, first and foremost, about fashion. They are about celebrating human creativity, design, and talent. The focus is seldom supposed to be on individual bodies, but on clothes and how they are worn. At their best, fashion shows are comparable to dance routines or theatre, using human bodies to create art. The values and enjoyment to be found in this are at the heart of most human societies. Artwork can be found in every ancient civilization, and fashion shows can and should be a modern, liberating expression of this. Why would we wish to prevent that? Why would we block off a form of entertainment and creativity that brings people pleasure? The talent of designers, choreographers, and makeup artists should not be overlooked, and their talents will go to waste if everyone were to suddenly refuse to walk. Fashion is a way of expressing ourselves, promoting self-worth, and representing a culture, religion, or identity. Fashion shows are these values writ large, a chance for wider forms of expression. Satara, for example, showcases different Asian cultures through the medium of fashion. National dress, modern trends, and cultural representations are important to many countries, and this is a useful way to begin and understand the context through which people view and express themselves. Not only this, but Satara uses fashion shows as a vehicle for performance art, something a lot of people appreciate and enjoy. These are all reasons to encourage people to walk, and why I think it is wrong we should prohibit people from doing so. Last year, Satara donated proceeds to its chosen charity, the Ashreya Initiative for Children in India. This is a community outreach project that houses and educates street children. For me personally, there is a direct connection between what they are trying to do in their fashion show and the money that they are raising. Even if not every single person who goes to that fashion show is aware of that cause, then they should be. We can work on promotion, we can change that. We shouldn't just stop fashion shows because not everyone is aware that the money is going to charity. Similarly, FS has raised over $380,000 since its foundation. Fashion shows are a fun way of raising large sums of money for charity. These causes need support, and it is the people who model who enable the events to happen. If we tell people not to walk, we are telling them not to take part in a fun activity with wider aims that raises money for charity. Why would we do this? Instead, we should take what is good about fashion shows and work on changing the bad. We should not simply dictate that people should not walk. They should walk if they want to. For these reasons, I urge the House to oppose this motion. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker for her fine words and call upon Alyssa to continue the debate.
So despite the fact that I've never been to a fashion show in St Andrews, which may or may not have something to do that I'm not really willing to shell out £100 to go to one, I'm really, really happy to speak today and say that I wouldn't walk. Beyond the fact that obviously I couldn't walk because I'm about 6 inches too short, I think a large reason why I support this motion is because I think the fashion shows in St Andrews have ultimately deteriorated into a parody of what a fashion show is meant to be, and have overwhelmingly contributed to the negative image of St Andrews I think most people really try to fight. The fact that St Andrews is a posh and elitist institution, which I think is really detrimental to people looking at the university and thinking of what it means to them. So before I get into my main point today, in which I'm going to talk about the elitist nature of these events and why that's extremely harmful both within St Andrews and outside of it, along with body image and exclusivity and the general conduct during these events, which I think most people probably think is not the best, I want to rebut some of the things that Jo said in her speech, which was excellent. First of all, the thing she talked about was free choice, and she said if you want to walk, you should be able to walk, and no one can tell you otherwise. Well, I think this is a really nice idea. It's just fundamentally untrue insofar as they are casting agents who will tell you if you don't have the right body type that you can't be a model in FS. I think at the point at which we do tell people actually you can't walk because you're not pretty enough, that ultimately gets at this idea that if you want to walk, you have the right to, when there's people telling you you just can't. Not at this time, sorry, maybe later. In terms of objectification, obviously, we're not saying that models bring this upon themselves. It's obviously not their fault. That's not something that we have to defend on the proposition today. And as much as we do think that change would be great, it seems quite unlikely. The culture of fashion shows in St Andrews has deteriorated to a point where it's become acceptable, and this is something that we think is something that we should definitely regret. Objectification is one of the many issues, many deplorable parts of the show, but it gets much worse, and I'll get to that in the depth of my speech. Beyond that, let me hear about some of the positives from Jo as well. I think she does make some good points about how fashion is an art form insofar as so is dance, so is music, things like that. It should be expressed. The problem, though, with fashion shows in St Andrews, though, again, is I think we have to realize that fashion shows in St Andrews are very distinct from fashion shows like the big ones in New York or Milan or wherever else they have them. People aren't going to look at the clothes. Most of the people who go there aren't really going to remember it the next day. They're not looking at the clothes. They're either looking at the models and grabbing them, or passing out on the floor and their friends taking funny pictures and posting them and it getting put in the Tatler. This is not actually about artistic expression to the vast majority of people who go. Even if some are going and think the clothes look pretty nice, I don't think that overwhelmingly outweighs the negatives of the situation, where the whole shenanigans of the thing is just about people getting blackout drunk and not remembering what happened. In terms of art goes away without the clothing, without these fashion shows, I also don't think that's necessarily true insofar as there's still pictorial advertisements and other ways that we can view clothes beyond the fashion shows. And I think that we're much actually more likely to look at them soberly and look at the clothes and value them as art if we're not looking at them while we've had a bottle of vodka that was provided to us for free on our £100 table. And while she does bring up Satara, which I think is a really good example, because that is definitely one of the fashion shows I think is A, underrated, and B, quite different from FS and Don't Walk. Even though I've not been to any of them, this is the impression I get from reading the reviews. It seems very fun, and it seems lively and wonderful. The thing that I think is a bit unfortunate here, though, is that it does get a bit lost in the mix. Insofar as when we think about fashion shows in St Andrews, we don't actually think of Satara. I think for the vast majority of people, we think about the shows that happen last weekend or next weekend. This is what we call fashion season, and Satara doesn't really seem to be a part of it. So while we do get some benefits from Satara, and while we may get some benefits from the show as a whole, I think the negatives vastly outweigh that, and I'll get to that now in my substantive. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the elitist nature of these events, and I think this is important in two respects. First of all, within St Andrews, and second of all, I think the image it gives St Andrews and the wider community. So first of all, within St Andrews, right, these shows are incredibly expensive and are extremely unaffordable to a large number of students here. While, of course, we do have many affluent students who can afford to go to these shows, the price on the tickets, which I'm not even really sure of because it's not advertised, I don't think, I've never really seen it on their advertisements, but you hear around the corner that's £100, seems particularly problematic. And I think this is especially true when we think about the fact that I think even in the way we worded this debate tonight, that St Andrews are a hallmark part of the St Andrews experience. Even if you don't go to one, they seem like something that's fundamentally quite St Andrews. But the vast majority of students here can't actually afford to go to one or aren't willing to pay the money to go to one. So when we put such an extremely high price on something that is trademark St. Andrews or hallmark St. Andrews, this is incredibly problematic to like the elitist nature of St. Andrews. It makes us think it's much worse. And this gets exacerbated with the different tiers of tickets, right? Because for these shows, it's not just a standard price. You can pay for a VIP table, or there might even be a VIP plus. I'm not really sure. I've never really looked into that because it's not been much of an option for me. But like even of the more affluent people who are going, the divide just gets even worse. Like when you hear people say things like if you're spending under £100, you're not doing it right because you're not getting all the free like alcohol or whatever. I think that makes the elitist nature of St. Andrews so much worse. And beyond that, that exacerbates the next day, even if you haven't gone. When you see posts on Yik Yak or photos of people passed out on the floor on Facebook, it doesn't make St. Andrews look particularly good. Which leads quite well into the image issue and the image of St. Andrews in the wider community, right? So these images aren't just shown within St. Andrews. The images appear in things like the Tatler. They appear in larger newspapers within the country. I think this is pretty problematic, right? Because for a university that seems to have a particular problem, looking posh and looking elitist, and looking like we don't have that much of a tolerance or there's not that much of a place for people who can't afford events such as this, when these are the things that are put forward, and these are the events that people see, it just further entrenches the idea that St. Andrews is an elitist institution. We're not seeing the photos of Sitara in these national newspapers, and those aren't the things that get reported. It's the big shows like FS and Don't Walk, which people can't, like most people, or a lot of people can't or don't want to pay to go to, that are the ones that are put forward. And I think this is particularly problematic given the image issue that St. Andrews already has. The next thing I want to talk to you about is body image and exclusivity, and why I think the fashion shows are particularly bad for that. And this comes in two ways. First of all, in scouting, and second of all, in the whole freedom of expression, maybe sex-positive feminism type thing. So in terms of scouting, right, frankly, the way that you get scouted for these shows is like, pretty bizarre. People go out of their way to approach pretty people, often them pulling them away from their friends that are shorter or don't have those great cheekbones, or whatever it is that really pretty models have, and telling them they should come try out for FS and things like this. The fact that they then scout particularly like pretty people or like a lot of scandos, it seems, is ultimately problematic because it entrenches the idea that only the beautiful people can be involved in charitable events, which seems a bit silly to me. But I think what's particularly relevant to this debate, and especially in nature of the fact that we're doing this with the feminist society, is arguments surrounding feminism and sex-positive feminism. Right? So even if the argument stands true that you should be free to express yourself, this, as I was saying in my rebuttal earlier, should stand true for everyone, not just for people that are like very skinny, quite tall, and have a nice face. So if you want to express yourself, sure, you should be able to do that, but the fashion shows don't physically make that possible. So we think that even if you did want to make the sex-positive feminism argument, it doesn't stand true in this debate, because not every woman, or not every person for that matter, is able to actually express themselves in this way, unless they're pretty tall and unless they have a pretty good body. So I think this constraint that you put on yourself, and the constraint you put on expressing yourself, like ultimately means that this isn't necessarily a good thing for feminism, isn't necessarily a good thing for body image, just isn't that great as a whole, in my opinion. But that brings me to my third point, right, which I think is something that most people end up hearing about whether they've been to the event or not, which is the conduct during the general events, and why I think this particularly detracts from all the positives that Joe's brought us. So first of all, I'll talk to you about inappropriate behavior briefly, and then get into the objectification and why this is particularly bad. So in terms of inappropriate behavior, you don't, like, I have never in my 3 years here heard of someone who's gone to FS, come back and said, whoa, those clothes blew me away. Like, that's not something you hear. Usually it's, I don't know where my phone is. Which there's been way too many of those posts in the last 3 days, and it's gotten a bit annoying. So usually the conduct at these shows isn't really that which a normal fashion show would occur, where people sit in rows like this and watch people walk down the runway and they look with their buyers and go, ooh, nice. Anyhow, the vastly inappropriate behavior, such as people, you know, being on the floor and not able to move and pretty, like, inebriated to the point where, like, they're not functional, leads to some pretty bad things. First bad thing, objectification, right? Like, at the point at which the models aren't even treated as human, which is what happens because we seem to kind of like celebritize them, insofar as there's an article in the Stand entitled follow, I don't remember the person's name, a day in the life of a model, right? Like when we see articles like this, we don't even seem to view them as human, and thus really drunk people seem to think it's okay to just grab at them and objectify them. This is obviously not something that's okay, and it's not the model's fault. It's the fault of the culture that's been built surrounding the fashion shows in St. Andrews. I think this is particularly bad for several reasons beyond just the obvious, and that objectification is bad. I think it's bad insofar as if we're looking at the purpose of fashion, there's just no respect for it, right? It's a parody of what a fashion show is. I think that even if there's beautiful pieces, people are never going to see this as they do in real fashion shows, especially given the fact that no one is that, like, sober or can remember it. But moreover, insofar as what Joe was talking about in terms of charity, right? I think while of course they do good things for charity and they have raised a lot of money, think how much more money they could raise if they didn't host such a ridiculously extravagant event. Like the mere indulgence and extravagance of the event means that you raise significantly less for charity. I think, and this is not particularly a plug, though it kind of is, balls such as Big Top Ball, which are for the charities campaign, are quite affordable at £30 with tickets being sold next Wednesday. And like very much stress that charity is at the centre of their giving. Also do things such as this. While of course FS and Don't Walk can raise a lot of money for charity, it's never on people's minds, and they could raise so much more if they change their culture, but they're unwilling to do that, because now these shows have been built up to a point where we think that they're not about the charity, they're not about the fashion, they're about going and not remembering what you've done. So at the end of the day, I don't think the fashion shows in St Andrews are a very good thing for everyone. I think they entrench a really horrible idea of St Andrews in people's minds, which is not something that I think any of us want. Beyond that, I think they're quite bad for body image. They're quite bad for a lot of the other things I've said, which I've turned my papers over and don't remember. But quite frankly, I don't think we really get the positives that we've wanted to get, that Joe's brought up to you, because I think at the end of the day, people aren't sober enough to remember what they did at the fashion show or what they saw. So for those reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Alyssa for her fine words and remind everybody that there are other balls available. And I call upon Carla to end the debate.
So before I go on to discuss some of the claims that Alyssa made in her last speech in regards with the elitist nature of this event, the kind of body type problems that it promotes, and overall the elitist nature of St Andrews that this further entrenches, I want to actually talk about a couple of things about the psychology generally that students have around donation, and why I actually think that FS and Don't Walk and these sorts of events are doing a very, very good job actually to engage students, to engage a demographic of the society that doesn't tend to actually want to give to charities, and why you're getting some net benefits as a result of these events, why these events would happen anyway, these sorts of events in terms of high-profile events, as Alyssa wants to class them, because I think there's a market for them in St Andrews. I think anybody would be silly to say otherwise. But I want to begin with that. So Lucas also, in the beginning of his speech, kind of asked why these events should basically look at putting on a big, glossy, high-profile event, and why that should be their focus over instead of just purely giving to charity, right? So before I get into that, I just want to give an anecdote about the kind of reading that I was coming up with when preparing for this debate. So it seems actually that last year, which is something that I actually distinctly remember, there was somewhat of a social media frenzy that was going around in the UK after actually the typhoon happened in the Philippines, which had obviously drastic consequences and was inspiring lots of donations from throughout the UK. But what's unique about it is that the kind of responses that it was generating were not merely just about the need to donate or the amounts in which people were donating. It was actually an emphasis on the fact that students in the UK, students in particular, the Twitter users that had never really previously ever posted on socio-political issues, felt that they had no obligation whatsoever to donate as a student. Basically, the findings were that they believed that the consensus was somewhat a dissatisfactory one. Many students basically believed that, while they're at university, their main obligation is to study, to use their student loan to merely scrape by, and then to donate basically when they're taxpayers later in life when they have a salary in order to do so. But while that argument on the surface seems like a somewhat of a plausible one, it kind of comes apart when we talk about the contemporary student lifestyle, which universities in St Andrews in particular have, right? So when we're talking about the struggles of how skint we are when we're sitting having a quinoa salad from Pret, there isn't much of a discussion to be had about talking about the fact that we don't merely have the kind of money in order to support these sort of charitable efforts. Obviously, that's not to say that there aren't some students that have a lower budget to begin with than others, but that's not necessarily true at all to say, especially here, that it is true for everyone, right? What is indicative of this mentality is that we're merely passing the buck on. The harms of this is that we on the whole, and this is just true for beyond our university, is that students tend to give substantially less in donations than any other demographic. So the main consequence of this, in a way, is that there's a significant belief that in order to donate, you need to do something more for students. We've seen this even with the RAG week that we had previously a couple of weeks ago, where there was a lot of emphasis on creating fun and entertaining events that intrigue students to get them to be able to recognize these kind of charitable efforts and to give something back, right? It requires students to have some kind of a prompt, because that sense of like obligation and duty is just missing on the whole with students. So what's actually happening is that we tend to overspend on relative luxuries. We go to Starbucks, we go to dinner out, we pay money to go to balls, etc. But the comparative here is that between the alternative of not attending any sorts of these events and then combining events that are highly lucrative to students, like shows like FS and Don't Walk are, is that we're actually creating some net benefits as a consequence of it, right? Moreover, if we just consider some of the facts that were brought out by the first speaker, like in the last 24 years, FS alone has raised £380,000. That's a lot of money towards charitable efforts, which actually, if you look into them at all, do quite a lot of work. And I can see that some of the students here would say, well, you know, the comparative is between having a ball like Big Top, which has been, you know, mentioned so far already, and having an FS-like event. And I'm going to get on to the objectification stuff in a minute, but I think that it's crucial that we entertain having a diversity in the social calendar, right? And I'm not actually saying, and I don't think it's true, all of the benefits that Alyssa puts forward on what kind of events these are. I think that when you actually talk about the kind of press that these events are starting to get, we look at publications like Vogue, like The Telegraph, and it was actually written in The Telegraph last year, I quote, "It's easy to forget an event of this scale is organized by a group of students. When the quality of sponsorships includes names like Bank of America or PwC, it actually seems that the guests on the whole are saying things like, for instance, someone quoted in the article, was like, I went to Yale, but this is unlike any university event I've ever seen in the States. The phenomenal scale of the evening and time sacrificed by these individuals really does reveal how unique Don't Walk in particular is, and actually how ambitious these artistic endeavors of these students can be." I think when we say that, like, that's the kind of press that these events are getting, it's not fair to be like, most of the students on the whole are not going to remember the clothes that the models were walking, or that they're not going to remember any of the kind of artistic sides of the event. I think that that's simply unfair and it's untrue, but moreover, I think that that's any of the kind of claims that you're going to hear after a ball of any other size or after an event like Big Top Ball. I myself was going after last year thinking, yeah, I raised some money as a consequence of going to Big Top Ball, but I also, you know, had a friend that lost their phone. That's the kind of chat that any student event has after the fact, right? So then it's about the kind of comparative at that point about what these events in particular are doing. And I think that we can actually see when we look at the kinds of money that these events are generating, that they are doing some net goods, right? And we think, moreover, that if you actually look at the size of these events, like these, you know, if you look at the actual amount of students that went to FS last year, it was over 1,000 guests, right? When you have that many students coming to an event, that's when you kind of get the big names of big corporate sponsorship, like you get the PwCs, you get the Bacardis, you get the Johnsons and Elgin. What they do is they help with event promotion within St. Andrews, and they also latch their names onto an event where they give a substantial amount of money to the causes that these events are generating. So while I think it may be true to an extent that these events attract a certain type of demographic within St. Andrews because of their hefty price tag, I think it's important to recognize that on the whole, most students can afford to go, right? It becomes a value judgment about where you want to spend your money, and there are those individuals that will save up to go to those sorts of events because they do actually feel that they get benefits out of it. You know, I think at the point at which we can look back and be like, people like Kate Middleton, who we now look as being, you know, extraordinarily into philanthropy, into charitable endeavors, walks down the aisle, which she did in Don't Walk in 2002, we can see that, you know, they attract different groups within society. And moreover, I think that we need to consider also the models that are actually walking down the runway, right? Because I think like some of the actual choice stuff, which Alyssa talks about in her speech, is probably fair of fashion shows in general, but I think a lot of the worries about coercion and objectification become removed at the point at which that we see that the actual models that these events are attracting are university students like ourselves. You know, it's not the case where you see sometimes in New York where it's like a 15-year-old who's dropped out of school to pursue this modeling career. These are students that are approached in the same way that if you were heard to be singing well at a party or playing an instrument well like a friend, that you would be approached to do a certain kind of group that adheres to that kind of talent. And moreover, while you say that it might be the case that it promotes a certain type of body image, I think even if we were to say that we stopped FS tomorrow, those kind of images would still exist, those kind of expectations of beauty. We don't think that actually in any way the causal effects of those, if anything, they're just a consequence of them. Moreover, I think that we can actually look at the fashion show culture and see that, like, events in New York this year when New York Fashion Week just ended, that you actually got a greater demographic on the runway that you've ever seen in the past. And I think at the point where that is starting to happen, that will trickle down to St. Andrews. And I think it's not fair to overlook events like Satara and say that, you know, those are kind of like on the bottom edge of people's radar, because I think it's a personal experience. I myself have been to those sorts of events, and I can say that I actually did look into the kind of charitable donations or charitable organizations in which I was donating to. So it becomes somewhat of a wash when it's propositions stand up and say, well, you know, I myself have never been to one of those events and I've never looked into the charities behind it. When we can see that actually, even if you accept that people don't do that, they're aware on some sense, and they're going to attend those sorts of events anyway. And we think it is actually greatly ambitious that the kind of leadership which they're getting and the kind of attraction that they're getting is that students are actually motivated to create an event that's worthwhile, that does raise and generate a large amount of money. Moreover, any of the actual, if you look at the kind of people that are putting on these events, they do seem to actually be motivated by the charities that they're supporting. And we think that they have great benefits for them when they're coming out of university. It's a great opportunity to be involved in a large event, one which attracts lots of attention and which can actually be very, very important when you're looking into graduate prospects. But just quickly, in terms of the elitist image of St. Andrews, I think that on the whole, while it might be the cost of the FS ticket is seen as somewhat of a barrier of entry for some, I think it's, again, more of an instance that St. Andrews as a whole caters to a more affluent demographic of students. I think it's the things like cost of rent and the fact that there are so many affluent families that come here that actually create that kind of perception. It is not the unique events of FS. When you look at the kind of press, like I already mentioned, that you get on those kind of events, it's not focusing on that kind of aspect of these events. Moreover, in terms of it in and of itself having issues of objectification, I think those are largely overcome when you're having university women, those that are going to St. Andrews that say, I want to be a part of this, they are capable of making that choice. I don't think any of them would say that they feel coerced into making that decision and that it doesn't offer anything above being put on a pedestal merely in terms of beauty. I think that these events actually do a lot of good and they do raise a lot of money, and I think that they are a great way of engaging a part of the population that would never otherwise donate, and I'm very, very proud to oppose this motion.